If you've ever tried to learn the exposure triangle and ended up more confused than when you started, trust me, you're not alone. You've got aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The way that they're usually explained is super technical and not easy to understand. That's why this video is different. I've got an easy to understand equation and I want to help you finally understand the exposure triangle. After this video, I promise that you'll make sense of how these three settings work together and you can finally take full creative control of your photography. Because once it clicks, everything about photography changes. You stop guessing, you stop relying on auto, and you start capturing photos the way that you want them to look. If we haven't met yet, my name is Mike and I'm an official Nikon creator and photography educator based in Australia. Over the past 2 years, I've helped millions of people understand photography with my daily videos on Instagram and TikTok. But this year I'm jumping onto YouTube because I think it's finally time that I dive a little bit deeper into my photography explainers and help people just like you understand photography. I want to talk about the exposure triangle today, but I want to do it in a different way than I've seen other people do it. Last week I shared a video on Instagram and people said that it was the best explanation that they've ever heard. Even people who went to school for photography said that this explanation finally helped them understand the exposure triangle. So I want to expand on that short 60-second video here and give you a full explanation of the exposure triangle and everything else that comes along with it. First things first, the exposure triangle is just a relationship between these three elements of your exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and your ISO. When it comes to capturing an image, these are the only three settings that we have in our camera to control the exposure. Let's jump into each of them and explain how they all work. Firstly, aperture is how wide or how narrow the lens opening is. If it's a big number like f16, that means it's a small aperture opening. I know, it's a little bit confusing, but you've got to remember that aperture is given as a fraction. It's not f2.8, it's f over 2.8. So as the number on the bottom of the fraction gets bigger, the aperture opening gets a lot smaller. f8 is a lot smaller than f1.2. Now, the smaller the hole, the less amount of light gets through in a given amount of time. The wider the hole, the more amount of light gets through in a given amount of time. That's aperture. Now, shutter speed is a lot more straightforward. It's just the amount of time that the shutter is open for. The longer you leave the shutter open, the more light gets through and hits your sensor. You can think of it like a tap. If you quickly turn on and off a tap, not much water gets out. But if you turn it on and leave it on, a lot more water comes through. A shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second is very fast and not much light will get through. Whereas the shutter speed of half a second is a lot slower and a lot more light will get through in that amount of time. And then finally we have ISO, which is basically the camera's sensitivity to light. The more sensitive it is, the more light that it will pick up. It's really an electronic amplification of the signal, so it's kind of like brightening a photo up while editing, except the camera is doing that while it's capturing the photo. Yes, it makes the whole image brighter, but it also introduces digital noise as you go brighter and brighter. I do want to say here though that ISO is not a bad thing. Too many photographers are scared of their ISO and so they just keep it as low as possible. But it's really just another component of our exposure triangle. Sometimes it's important to increase your ISO to balance out the other variables, aperture and shutter speed, in order to get a nice exposure. Now that we know what the three variables are, let me get back to explaining what the exposure triangle actually is. It's basically a combination of these three elements, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, which will give you an exposure. You can think of it like an equation. Aperture times shutter speed times ISO equals exposure. Now this definitely isn't an equation. You can't just multiply all the numbers together and get an exposure, but it is a really good way to think about it. The reason that I love the equation metaphor so much is because a combination of these three elements will give you an exposure relative to your current environment. And as we'll get to later, if you change one variable, you then have to go and change another variable in the opposite direction. But as I said, it's an equation that gives you an exposure relative to your current environment. If, for example, you were taking photos outside and then you walk inside to take photos, your whole equation changes because your environment has changed. But again, if we're in the same environment, we can just keep the same settings in our equation. This is why manual mode is so important. If the lighting doesn't change, you can keep the same combination of settings and all of your images will have the exact same exposure. There are some times, however, that you want to change your settings but still keep the same overall exposure. Let's say, for example, you took this photo and the lighting was perfect, not too bright or not too dark, but your subject was blurry. That's normally because your shutter speed was too low and your subject moved while you had the shutter open. So I need to make my shutter speed faster in order to freeze the motion. But if I do that, my image will get darker because we know that faster shutter speeds allow less light to come through. So in order to balance out the exposure and get it back to where it was before, I need to increase one of the other elements and let more light back in. All the components in the exposure triangle are relative. If one goes down, another one must come up. So these were my original settings. I took the photo at f4, ISO 100 and a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second. Now we know we need to increase the shutter speed to freeze the motion. So let's say we put the shutter speed up to 1/200th of a second. If we just change the shutter speed, this would be our image. The motion is frozen, but the image is way too dark. So how do we know how much to increase the other settings to get our exposure back to where it was? Well, you could use trial and error and just see what works, or you could learn about stops of light, and that's what I want to talk about now. If you've been a photographer for a while, you've undoubtedly heard of the term a stop of light. Some people might say that they want to add a stop of light, or they want to remove one stop of light. You may have even used ND filters before, which are named as such. You could have a 2-stop ND filter or a 6-stop ND filter. These are designed to remove stops of light. So what is a stop of light? Well, it's a relative term for either halving or doubling your current exposure. If I want to add one stop of light, that means I'm just doubling my overall exposure. And if I say I want to remove one stop of light, that means I just want to halve my overall exposure. Each one of the variables in the exposure triangle can be used to either add or remove stops of light. Let's first take shutter speed. If we want to halve our overall exposure, we simply have to halve our shutter speed. Half the shutter speed means the shutter is open for half as long. And if it's open for half as long, that means half the amount of light gets through. It's the exact same the other way. If we double our shutter speed, that means double the amount of light gets through. And now with ISO, it's also very similar. If we want to add one stop of light with ISO, we just double our ISO. If we double the ISO, we're really doubling our camera's sensitivity to light. And if we double the sensitivity to light, that means we double our overall exposure. And the opposite is true. If you want to remove one stop of light, you just halve your ISO. Now, aperture is where it gets a little bit confusing, but if you're still here watching, I'm sure you're committed to learning this. To remove one stop of light using aperture, we need to halve the size of the aperture opening. If we halve the area that the light comes through, that means half as much light will actually get through. Now don't worry, you don't have to understand any complex maths here. The way that the aperture numbers are calculated actually makes it very easy for us to work out. I'm sure you've seen this sequence before. This is the sequence of aperture numbers, each one stop of light apart. That means that as I go up each one of these numbers, the aperture opening becomes half the size. If you really do want to know the maths, it's just a sequence where we multiply each number by the square root of 2 each time. Now the square root of 2 is approximately 1.4. So 1 times 1.4 is 1.4. 1.4 times 1.4 is 2. 2 times 1.4 is 2.8, and so on and so on. So if you want to remove one stop of light, you could go from f4 to f5.6. And if you wanted to add one stop of light, you could go from f4 to f2.8. Okay, so now that we have all of that out of the way, let's get back to our original dilemma. Remember, we took a photo at f4, ISO 100, and a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second. But the subject was blurry, so we need to increase the shutter speed to stop the motion. We increased our shutter speed to 1/200th of a second, but now our image is way too dark. How do we change the other settings around to get back to our original exposure? Well, let's calculate how many stops of light we removed by going from 1/25th of a second to 1/200th of a second. Remember that if we halve our shutter speed, we remove one stop of light. If we halve 1/25th of a second, we get 1/50th of a second. If we do it again, we get 1/100th of a second. And if we do it again, we get 1/200th of a second. That means we removed 3 stops of light from our original exposure. So to balance out our exposure, we need to add back 3 stops of light using the other variables. We can either use one of them or a combination of both. So let's add light by making our aperture wider. I took the original image at f4, but let's add one stop of light and go to f2.8. Remember, that's from our sequence from before. But now we've run into a little bit of an issue because the camera lens that I'm using is only an f2.8 lens, which means I can't go any wider than f2.8. So that means that I can only add that one stop of light using my aperture. But that's okay because I can add the other 2 stops of light using my ISO. How do I add 2 stops of light using ISO? I just double my ISO twice. So from ISO 100 up to ISO 200, and then from ISO 200 up to ISO 400. So my updated camera settings are now f2.8, ISO 400, and a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. And I have the exact same exposure as before. Here's my original image on the left, and my updated image on the right. Same exposure, completely different settings. The exposure triangle is just an easy way to understand the relationship between these 3 settings. Remember, to keep the same exposure, if one goes up, another one must come down. It's actually quite easy on your camera because usually your settings change in plus or minus a third of a stop. Like you might notice as you scroll the aperture wheel, it goes from f4 to f4.5 to f5 to f5.6. Each one of those steps is 1/3 of a stop because remember from our original sequence, f4 to f5.6 is 1 stop. It's the exact same with shutter speed. You'll notice that it goes from 1/200th of a second down to 1/160th of a second, down to 1/125th of a second, and then to 1/100th of a second. Each of those increments is 1/3 of a stop of light. So if you increase your shutter speed by 1 click to the right, Just decrease your aperture by 1 click to the left. If one goes up, one must come down. If you lower your aperture by 2 stops, making the image darker, you just have to add back those 2 stops of light using one of the other 2 settings. You just have to balance out the original equation from before. If one setting goes up by 2 stops, then you need to bring the other ones down by 2 stops. You can either do a combination of both or just 2 stops on one of them. As a bonus, these calculations are particularly important when we're using ND filters for long exposure photography. What ND filters do is they block out a certain amount of light, designated by how many stops they are. This right here is a 15 stop ND filter, which means it's going to cut out 15 stops of light, or make my image 15 times darker. So if I was taking a photo during the daytime at f8, ISO 100 and 1/400th of a second, this is the image, but the water is still quite choppy and I want it to be really smooth. In order to make the water smooth, I need to slow down my shutter speed and effectively blur out the water. But my lens only goes down to f16, which is only 2 stops darker than f8. So if I bring my aperture down to f16, that means I can increase my shutter speed by 2 stops. Increasing my shutter speed by 2 stops means I go from 1/400th of a second up to 1/100th of a second, but that's still not slow enough to blur out the water. So instead, I can just add an ND filter to my lens to remove light from my image. As I said, this is a 15 stop ND filter, so it's going to remove 15 stops of light. That means to get the same exposure as my initial test shot, I need to add back 15 stops of light using my shutter speed. To add 15 stops of light using my shutter speed, that means I need to double my shutter speed 15 times. Starting from my original settings of f8, ISO 100 and 1/400th of a second, if I double my shutter speed, I get up to 1/200th of a second. If I double it again, I get to 1/100th of a second. Again, 1/50th of a second. Again, 1/25th of a second. And if I do that 15 times, I get to about 81 seconds, which is more than enough to smooth out the water. Now, all that I need to do is set my shutter speed on my camera to 81 seconds. Granted, your camera might not let you set a shutter speed of 81 seconds, so I'm going to use 90 seconds because that's close enough. But if you've got a remote trigger, you might be able to put in 81 seconds. And here is the final result. It's the exact same exposure as my initial test shot, but now the water is so much smoother because I opened my shutter speed for so long. I was only able to do that though because I had my ND filter. And remember that you definitely need a tripod for long exposure photography because you could not handhold a shot for 90 seconds. If the shutter is open for 90 seconds, even the smallest bit of camera shake is going to destroy your whole image. And there we go. I really hope you did enjoy this video and it helped you understand the exposure triangle and how to calculate a stop of light. If this video was helpful or you have any questions, please do leave a comment down below and I'll do my best to get in there. I want to make a bunch more of these in-depth explainers because I think it's really important to deep dive on some of these settings. I'm a pretty meticulous person and I like explaining things in an easy to understand way. So if you did get something out of this video, I would really appreciate the feedback. Apart from that, just make sure you get out there and actually practice these things. Watching videos like mine is great, but you're always going to get the most out of it when you go out there and practice those skills in the real world. But I do hope that you come back and join me in the next video.